August 7, 1943, Wright Field, Dayton, Ohio. The summer heat shimmered off the concrete runway as Major General Curtis LeMay stood beside an aircraft that shouldn't exist. The B-29 Superfortress towered above him, its polished aluminum skin reflecting the afternoon sun like a mirror. 4 massive Wright R-3350 engines hung from wings so long they seemed to bend under their own weight. Everything about this machine defied conventional wisdom. It was too heavy, too complex, too ambitious. And yet, in less than 2 years, it would fly higher than any heavy bomber in history, reaching altitudes where enemy fighters gasped for air and died. LeMay circled the aircraft slowly, his hands clasped behind his back. He had commanded B-17 flying fortress formations over Europe. He understood the brutal mathematics of strategic bombing. Altitude meant survival. Every 1,000 feet above enemy fighters translated to fewer losses, more missions completed, more crews coming home. The B-17 could reach 25,000 feet on a good day. The B-24 Liberator struggled to climb past 22,000. Both operated within the envelope where German and Japanese fighters could engage effectively. Both bled crews at unsustainable rates. The B-29 was different. Its designers promised a service ceiling of 31,850 feet, nearly 6 miles above sea level, higher than Mount Everest's base camp. At that altitude, the air pressure dropped to less than 1/3 of sea level. Temperatures plunged to 60 degrees below zero. Oxygen became so thin that unprotected men would lose consciousness in seconds. It was an environment where human physiology broke down, where conventional aircraft engines choked and failed, where the laws of aerodynamics rewrote themselves. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. LeMay knew the specifications by heart. Maximum speed 357 miles per hour, range 3,250 miles, bomb load 20,000 pounds, but the number that mattered most was that ceiling, 31,850 feet. If the B-29 could truly operate at that altitude, it would fly above the effective range of every Japanese fighter in existence. Japanese commanders would watch helplessly as American bombers crossed their airspace untouched, raining destruction on cities, factories, and military installations. But there was a problem. No one had ever built a bomber capable of sustained operations at that altitude. The engineering challenges were staggering. At 30,000 feet, air density dropped so low that wings needed enormous surface area to generate lift. Engines required turbochargers to force enough oxygen into cylinders for combustion. Crews needed pressurized compartments to survive. Every system, from fuel delivery to hydraulic controls, had to function in conditions that destroyed conventional aircraft. The Boeing engineering team had spent 4 years wrestling with these challenges. They had started with a blank sheet of paper and a requirement that seemed impossible. Build a bomber that could fly from bases in the Mariana Islands to Tokyo and back, carry 10 tons of bombs, operate above enemy fighter range, return safely. The design that emerged was revolutionary. A pressurized fuselage that maintained sea-level pressure while flying 6 miles high. Turbochargers that fed compressed air to engines starved of oxygen. Remote-controlled defensive turrets that eliminated the need for gunners to sit exposed in unpressurized positions. And wings, massive wings that stretched 141 feet from tip to tip, larger than any previous American bomber. LeMay climbed through the forward hatch and into the B-29's pressurized compartment. The interior felt like stepping into another world. Previous bombers were flying metal tubes, drafty, freezing, filled with the roar of engines and the whistle of wind through gaps in the fuselage. The B-29 was different. The cabin was sealed, insulated, climate-controlled. Crew members could work without bulky oxygen masks or heated suits. They could communicate without shouting over engine noise. For the first time in aviation history, men could fight a war at 30,000 feet while breathing normally. But the pressurization system created its own dangers. The fuselage had to withstand enormous stress. At 30,000 feet, The pressure differential between inside and outside reached over 10 pounds per square inch. The aluminum skin had to contain that pressure while absorbing combat damage, turbulence, and the thermal cycles of climbing from sea level to the stratosphere. Any crack, any weakness, any imperfection in the welds could trigger explosive decompression. The entire cabin would lose pressure in seconds, leaving the crew gasping for oxygen in air too thin to sustain consciousness. Boeing engineers had addressed this by dividing the pressurized space into 3 separate compartments: forward cabin for pilots, bombardier, and flight engineer; central cabin for gunners operating the remote fire control system; aft cabin for the tail gunner. Each compartment could be sealed independently. If one lost pressure, the others remained intact. It was redundancy built into every system, the same philosophy that would define American aircraft design for the next half-century. LeMay moved to the cockpit. The instrument panel looked like the control room of a power plant. Dozens of gauges monitored engine performance, fuel flow, oil pressure, cylinder head temperature, turbocharger output. 4 throttle levers, each controlling a Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone engine, 2,200 horsepower per engine, 8,800 horsepower total, more power than 10 Sherman tanks combined. And yet, the B-29 needed every fraction of that power to reach its designed altitude. The Wright R-3350 was itself a marvel of engineering desperation. An 18-cylinder radial engine so complex that early versions caught fire regularly, overheated catastrophically, and suffered mechanical failures at rates that grounded entire squadrons. Wright Aeronautical had thrown everything they knew at the problem: improved cooling fins, upgraded fuel injection, reinforced connecting rods, better oil circulation. The R-3350 remained temperamental, difficult to maintain, prone to overheating during climbs. But when it worked, it produced power at altitudes where other engines simply quit. The key was the turbocharger system. At sea level, air pressure forced sufficient oxygen into engine cylinders for normal combustion. At 30,000 feet, air pressure dropped to 30% of sea level. Without turbocharging, the R-3350 would produce barely 30% of its rated power, not enough to keep the B-29 airborne. The turbochargers solved this by using exhaust gases to spin turbines that compressed incoming air before feeding it to the engine. The system maintained manifold pressure equivalent to sea-level conditions, even at extreme altitude. It was like giving the engine an artificial atmosphere. But turbochargers added weight, complexity, and heat. Each B-29 carried 4 complete turbocharger systems, 1 per engine. Each system included turbines, compressors, intercoolers, ducting, regulators, and control mechanisms. The entire installation added over 3,000 pounds to the aircraft's empty weight, and the heat generated by compressing air created new problems. Exhaust gases entering the turbines reached temperatures above 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. The compressed air leaving the turbochargers was hot enough to cause preignition in engine cylinders. Boeing engineers installed intercoolers, heat exchangers that cooled compressed air before it entered the engine. The system worked, but barely. LeMay studied the engine instruments: oil temperature, cylinder head temperature, exhaust gas temperature, turbocharger RPM. Each gauge told a story about the delicate balance required to operate at altitude. Push too hard and cylinder heads would overheat, causing detonation that shattered pistons and connecting rods. Pull back too much and the engine would lose power, unable to maintain altitude. The R-3350 demanded constant attention, constant adjustment, constant vigilance from flight engineers who monitored dozens of parameters simultaneously. He turned to the bombardier's station. The Norden bomb sight sat in its mounting, a mechanical analog computer that calculated bombing trajectories based on altitude, airspeed, wind direction, and target coordinates. At 30,000 feet, bombs would fall for nearly 40 seconds before impacting the ground. During that time, wind could push them hundreds of yards off course. The Norden sight compensated, automatically, adjusting for atmospheric conditions in real time. It was precision bombing from an altitude where human vision could barely distinguish cities from countryside. The defensive armament system caught LeMay's attention next. 12 Browning .50 caliber machine guns mounted in 5 remotely controlled turrets, 4 turrets positioned on the fuselage, 1 in the tail. All controlled by gunners sitting inside pressurized compartments, operating electronic sighting stations that directed unmanned turrets. It was the same system that Japanese pilots would discover 6 months later, the same system that would make the B-29 nearly impossible to shoot down. But in August 1943, it was still experimental, untested in combat, and prone to mechanical failures that left bombers defenseless. LeMay climbed down from the B-29 and stood on the ramp, staring at the massive aircraft. The Air Force had already ordered 1,500 B-29 seconds before the first prototype flew. Boeing's factories in Renton, Washington, and Wichita, Kansas, were tooling up for mass production. Bell Aircraft in Atlanta and Martin in Omaha were building components. By 1945, the plan called for producing over 300 B-29 seconds per month. But first, the aircraft had to prove it could actually fly at 31,000 feet, and more importantly, it had to prove it could fight there. September 5th, 1943, Boeing Field, Seattle. Test pilot Eddie Allen pushed the throttles forward and felt the B-29 prototype accelerate down the runway. The aircraft was heavy, overweight with test equipment and instrumentation. The wings flexed alarmingly as the bomber lifted off, climbing slowly into the morning sky. Allen had flown every prototype Boeing had built in the past decade. He knew aircraft behavior by instinct, and he knew immediately that something was wrong. The number 1 engine, outboard left, was running hot, cylinder head temperature rising past, red line, oil pressure fluctuating. Allen throttled back, reducing power to the troubled engine. The B-29 continued climbing, but more slowly. At 8,000 feet, the number 1 engine caught fire. Flames streamed back from the cowling, fed by leaking fuel and hot oil. Allen hit the fire suppression system. Carbon dioxide flooded the engine compartment. The flames died briefly, then reignited. The fire was inside the engine, burning in places the suppression system couldn't reach. Allen turned back toward Boeing Field, descending rapidly. But the fire spread. Flames burned through aluminum cowling and into the wing structure. The wing's main spar, the structural backbone that held the wing to the fuselage, began to weaken from heat. At 3,000 feet, the wing failed. The outboard section folded upward, then separated completely from the aircraft. The B-29 rolled inverted and plunged into a Seattle meatpacking plant. Allen and his entire crew died instantly. 21 workers in the plant died in the fire that followed. The crash investigation revealed the R-3350's fundamental flaw. The engine ran too hot. Cooling fins couldn't dissipate heat fast enough during climbs. Cylinder head temperatures exceeded design limits, causing fuel in the intake manifold to ignite prematurely. The resulting fires burned in spaces that couldn't be accessed by firefighting systems, and because the engines were mounted close to the wing's fuel tanks, any engine fire threatened the entire aircraft. Wright Aeronautical spent the next year redesigning the R-3350's cooling system. They enlarged cooling fins. They improved baffling to direct more air over cylinder heads. They modified fuel injection to reduce preignition risk. They installed additional fire suppression equipment. But the fundamental problem remained. The R-3350 was an engine designed for high-altitude operation being pushed beyond its thermal limits. It would remain the B-29's greatest weakness throughout the war. Despite the setbacks, production continued. The Army Air Forces needed the B-29 operational by mid-1944 to support the planned invasion of Japan. There was no alternative aircraft, no backup plan. The B-29 would work, or the strategic bombing campaign against Japan would fail. Thousands of workers in Boeing plants across the country worked double shifts assembling B-29 seconds. Women riveted aluminum skin to frames. Men installed engines, wiring, hydraulic lines. Assembly lines stretched the length of football fields. Every hour, another B-29 moved closer to completion. By March 1944, the first operational B-29 seconds arrived at bases in India and China. The aircraft looked magnificent on the ramp, gleaming aluminum giants that dwarfed every other bomber in the theater. But when crews attempted their first high-altitude missions, reality intruded. Engines overheated during climbs. Turbochargers failed at altitude. Pressurization systems leaked. Defensive turrets jammed. Bombing accuracy proved abysmal in the thin air and high winds of the stratosphere. The missions failed. Colonel Henry Mucci commanded the 1st B-29 Squadron deployed to China. He wrote in his mission report, "The aircraft performs as designed on paper, but combat is not conducted on paper. We are learning that high-altitude bombing presents challenges our training did not address. Engine reliability remains our primary concern. We cannot maintain altitude if engines fail during missions. We cannot defend the bomber if turrets malfunction. We cannot hit targets if bomb sites cannot compensate for winds aloft. The B-29 has the potential to change this war, but that potential has not yet been realized." The early missions from China targeted steel mills in Japan. The B-29 seconds climbed laboriously to 28,000 feet, far below their design ceiling, constrained by engine overheating and fuel consumption. Japanese fighters rose to meet them. Nakajima, key 44 seconds, and Kawasaki, key 61 seconds, pushed to their maximum performance, barely reaching the bomber's altitude. The fighters attacked in desperation, knowing they had only minutes before their engines overheated or fuel ran out. Most attacks failed. The B-29's defensive fire drove them off, but a few fighters pressed close enough to score hits. 3 B-29 seconds fell during the first month of operations. The problem wasn't Japanese fighters, it was the bombers themselves. Mechanical failures killed more B-29 seconds than enemy action. Engines caught fire during climbs. Fuel transfer systems malfunctioned, leaving aircraft stranded at forward bases. Hydraulic failures locked landing gear in the up position, forcing crews to belly land. The B-29 was the most technically advanced bomber ever built, and that complexity made it fragile. LeMay took command of the B-29 force in August 1944. He understood immediately that the aircraft wasn't being used correctly. The B-29 had been designed for high-altitude precision bombing, but at 30,000 feet, bombing accuracy dropped below 10%. Bombs drifted in winds that exceeded 100 miles per hour. Clouds obscured targets. The Norden bomb sight, accurate at lower altitudes, struggled to calculate trajectories in the thin air of the stratosphere. LeMay studied the data and reached a conclusion that contradicted everything the B-29 represented. High altitude wasn't working. But before he could implement changes, he needed to prove the aircraft could actually reach its design ceiling. If the B-29 couldn't fly at 31,000 feet reliably, consistently, with full combat loads, then the entire strategic concept failed. In September 1944, LeMay ordered a series of maximum altitude test flights. Crews would push B-29 seconds to their absolute ceiling, document engine performance, test defensive systems, and measure bombing accuracy. The tests would determine whether the B-29's promise of invulnerability through altitude was real or fantasy. Captain James Patillo drew the first test mission. His B-29, serial number 42-65093, had been modified with additional instrumentation to record engine temperatures, fuel consumption, and structural stress. The aircraft carried a reduced bomb load, 8,000 pounds instead of the normal 20,000, to maximize altitude capability. At dawn on September 12, 1944, Patillo advanced the throttles and felt the B-29 leap forward. The bomber climbed steadily through 20,000 feet. Engine instruments remained in normal ranges. Turbochargers maintained manifold pressure. The crew breathed normally in the pressurized cabin. At 25,000 feet, the rate of climb decreased. The engines were producing maximum continuous power, but the thin air provided less lift. Wings had to work harder to keep the bomber aloft. At 28,000 feet, the climb slowed to less than 100 feet per minute. The R-3350 engines were operating at their limits. Cylinder head temperatures approached red line, oil temperatures climbed, exhaust gas temperatures exceeded normal ranges. Patillo's flight engineer, Technical Sergeant Robert Kimmons, monitored the engine instruments with growing concern. Number 3 engine showed signs of detonation. Brief spikes in cylinder head temperature indicated fuel was igniting prematurely in the combustion chamber. Detonation created shock waves that could shatter pistons, bend connecting rods, and destroy engines in seconds. Kimmons leaned the fuel mixture, reducing the amount of fuel entering the cylinders. The detonation stopped, but power output dropped. At 30,000 feet, the B-29 was barely climbing. The altimeter crept upward. 30,500, 30,700, 30,900. The aircraft shuddered as it pushed through air so thin that wings approached their aerodynamic limits. Outside temperature had dropped to 55 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, but inside the pressurized cabin, the crew remained comfortable. Patillo glanced at his co-pilot, First Lieutenant David Chen. "We're going to make it," he said quietly. The altimeter needle touched 31,000 feet, then 31,500. At 31,800 feet, the climb stopped. They had reached the B-29's absolute ceiling, the altitude where rate of climb dropped to 0. Any higher, and the aircraft would stall, unable to maintain level flight. They had achieved what the designers promised. The B-29 could fly at 31,850 feet. But Patillo wasn't celebrating. He was studying the engine instruments. All 4 R-3350 seconds were running at maximum temperature. The slightest increase in power demand would trigger overheating. The slightest decrease in power output would cause the bomber to descend. They were balanced on a knife edge, operating in an envelope where any disturbance, a gust of wind, a control input, a change in weight distribution, could push them out of controlled flight. This wasn't an altitude where aircraft could operate routinely. It was an altitude where they could barely survive. The bombardier, Second Lieutenant Thomas Wright, tried to use the Norden bomb site. At this altitude, the ground appeared hazy, indistinct. Wright could barely distinguish roads from rivers, cities from forests. Wind aloft exceeded 120 miles per hour. Any bomb dropped from this height would drift miles off course before impacting. Precision bombing was impossible. Wright recorded in his mission log, visibility inadequate for target identification. Wind speed exceeds bomb site compensation capability. Recommend operations below 25,000 feet for acceptable accuracy. The defensive gunners attempted to track simulated targets. The remote turrets responded sluggishly in the thin air. Hydraulic systems struggled to move heavy gun assemblies, citing optics frosted over from temperature differentials. Gunner Sergeant Michael Torres reported, "Turrets functional but degraded. Response time doubled compared to lower altitude operations. Ice formation on optical sites reduces visibility. Recommend operations below 28,000 feet for effective defensive fire." After 30 minutes at maximum altitude, Patillo began descent. The B-29 responded gratefully, engines cooling as power demands decreased. By 25,000 feet, all systems had returned to normal operating parameters. The test flight proved the B-29 could reach its design ceiling, but it also proved that operating at that altitude was impractical for combat missions. LeMay read the mission reports with growing frustration. The B-29 had been designed around a single concept: fly high enough and enemy fighters cannot reach you. But the reality was more complex. Yes, Japanese. Fighters struggled at 30,000 feet, but so did the B-29. Engine reliability decreased. Bombing accuracy dropped to unacceptable levels. Defensive systems degraded. And the fuel required to climb to maximum altitude reduced range, forcing bombers to carry lighter bomb loads or stage through forward bases. The data was clear. The B-29 could fly at 31,000 feet. but it couldn't fight effectively there. LeMay began planning a different approach. If altitude didn't provide invulnerability, perhaps overwhelming force would. Instead of sending small formations at maximum altitude, he would send massive formations at medium altitude. 300 bombers at 25,000 feet would saturate Japanese air defenses. Fighters attempting to intercept would face coordinated defensive fire from hundreds of turrets. The B-29's real strength wasn't altitude. It was the ability to mass-produce an advanced bomber and deploy it in numbers that made interception suicidal for defenders. But before LeMay could implement this strategy, events in Europe changed everything. In November 1944, Allied intelligence reported that German engineers had examined captured American bombers and were developing new high-altitude fighters specifically designed to intercept B-29 seconds. The Luftwaffe, desperate to counter Allied bombing, was preparing to transfer technology and tactics to Japan. If German knowledge of high-altitude interception reached Japanese engineers, the B-29's altitude advantage would disappear. December 19, 1944. Rechlin Air Base, Northern Germany. Oberst Friedrich Weber stood in a briefing room filled with Luftwaffe technical officers, listening to a proposal that sounded like science fiction. The Reich Air Ministry had summoned him from his duties overseeing jet fighter development to discuss a new assignment. Japan needed help countering the B-29 Superfortress. Weber would lead a technical mission to share German, high-altitude interception knowledge with Japanese engineers. Weber knew the B-29 by reputation only. Intelligence reports described an American bomber larger than anything in the Luftwaffe's inventory, capable of flying higher than German fighters could effectively intercept. The parallels to Germany's own situation were obvious. For 2 years, American B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds had bombed German cities from altitudes where Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf fighters struggled to maintain performance. Germany had responded by developing specialized high-altitude interceptors. The TAR-152H, the Junkers Ju-388, the Dornier Du-335, each designed to fight in the thin air above 30,000 feet. But development had come too late. By December 1944, the Luftwaffe was collapsing. Allied fighters controlled German airspace. Fuel shortages grounded entire fighter wings. Experienced pilots were dead or missing. The specialized high-altitude interceptors existed only as prototypes, limited production runs. Weber's assignment was to share what Germany had learned, to help Japan avoid the same mistakes. He wondered if the knowledge would arrive in time to matter. The briefing officer, Major Klaus Hoffmann, spread photographs across the table. Images captured by German intelligence agents in Switzerland showed B-29 seconds at American bases in India. The bombers dwarfed the C-47 transports parked beside them. Hoffmann pointed to the engines. 4 Wright R-3350 radials, 2,200 horsepower each, turbocharged for high-altitude operation, similar in concept to our BMW 801 TJ, but larger and more powerful. Weber studied the photographs. The B-29's wings were enormous, far larger than necessary for an aircraft of that weight. He recognized the design philosophy immediately. The Americans had traded maneuverability for altitude capability. Those wings would generate tremendous lift in thin air, allowing the bomber to operate where conventional aircraft stalled. "What's their operational ceiling?" he asked. 31,800 feet, Hoffmann replied. Confirmed by multiple sources. They routinely operate above 28,000 feet on combat missions. Weber did the mathematics in his head. At 30,000 feet, air pressure dropped to roughly 30% of sea level. Temperature fell to 50 degrees below zero. Any fighter attempting interception at that altitude would be operating at the edge of its performance envelope. Engines would produce barely half their rated power. Climb rates would drop to near zero. Pilots would have perhaps 5 minutes of combat time before fuel exhaustion forced them to descend. And if the Americans flew even higher, interception became physically impossible. The Japanese are facing the same problem we did with the American daylight raids, Hoffmann continued. Their fighters can reach the B-29 seconds altitude, barely. But they cannot fight effectively there. Engines overheat, fuel, consumption increases, armament effectiveness decreases in the thin air. They need what we developed: pressurized cockpits, more powerful superchargers, high-altitude gunnery tactics. Weber thought of the TAR-152H, Germany's most advanced high-altitude fighter. It featured a pressurized cockpit that maintained sea-level pressure at 40,000 feet, a MW-50 boost system that injected methanol water mixture into the supercharger for emergency power, extended wings that provided additional lift in thin air. The aircraft could climb to 48,000 feet, higher than any Allied bomber, but only 70 had been built before production facilities were bombed. The design existed. The manufacturing capacity didn't. Japan lacks the industrial base to build fighters like the TAR-152, Weber said quietly. Even if we provide complete blueprints, they cannot manufacture the pressurization systems, the fuel injection systems, the specialized alloys. They are where we were in 1940. We are giving them knowledge they cannot implement. Hoffman nodded. The Air Ministry understands this, but they want Japan to remain in the war as long as possible. Every month, Japan draws American resources away from Europe. If we can help Japanese fighters inflict even modest losses on B-29 formations, it justifies the effort. The plan called for Weber and a team of 6 specialists to travel by submarine to Japan, carrying microfilm copies of technical documents, engine specifications, and tactical manuals. The voyage would take 3 months, traveling underwater through Allied-controlled waters. If they arrived, they would spend 6 months training Japanese engineers and pilots in high-altitude interception techniques. If they didn't arrive, the knowledge died with them. Weber accepted the assignment. Not because he believed it would change the war's outcome, but because sitting in Germany watching the Reich collapse felt worse than attempting anything, that might matter. On January 8, 1945, he boarded U-boat 234 at Kiel Harbor. The submarine carried a cargo that read like a museum of desperate German innovation: infrared night vision equipment, acoustic torpedoes, turbojet engine components. And in Weber's personal luggage, documents describing every high-altitude aviation technique Germany had developed. The submarine submerged and turned west, then south, navigating through the North Atlantic. Weber spent the voyage in a coffin-sized bunk, reading by flashlight, preparing briefings he might never deliver. He studied reports from Japanese air defense units. The accounts described B-29 raids at altitudes Japanese fighters could barely reach. Nakajima Key 44 seconds and Key 84 seconds pushed to their limits, climbing through oxygen-starved air, arriving at interception altitude with fuel gauges already showing minimum reserves. And when they attacked, the B-29 seconds defensive fire drove them off or destroyed them. One report caught Weber's attention. A Japanese pilot described attempting a head-on attack against a B-29 formation at 28,000 feet. His fighter's engine had overheated during the climb. When he opened fire, his cannons jammed from the extreme cold. The B-29's defensive turrets engaged him from 800 yards, tracking with impossible accuracy. He broke off the attack after 3 seconds, his aircraft riddled with .50 caliber rounds. He crash-landed at his home airfield with both legs wounded and his fighter a total loss. The pilot's final comment summed up Japan's dilemma. "We cannot fight at this altitude. Our aircraft were not designed for it." Weber knew that feeling. He had flown Messerschmitt Bf 109 seconds against American bombers in 1943 before he transitioned to engineering duties. He remembered the frustration of climbing to 28,000 feet, watching his engine temperatures rise and power output fall, knowing that the bombers above him were operating comfortably while he struggled to maintain consciousness. The Americans had solved high-altitude flight through engineering: pressurized cabins, turbocharged engines, oxygen systems that worked reliably. German and Japanese pilots fought altitude like an enemy, as dangerous as the bombers themselves. U-234 reached the mid-Atlantic on February 4, 1945. The submarine's radio operator received a coded message from Kiel. Allied forces had crossed the Rhine. Berlin was under siege. The war in Europe was ending. Weber read the message in the submarine's cramped radio room, feeling the walls close in around him. Everything he knew, everything he had worked to build, was collapsing, and he was sailing away from it, carrying knowledge to an ally that couldn't use it, pursuing a mission that no longer mattered. On May 4, 1945, while U-234 was crossing the equator off the coast of Brazil, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The submarine's captain, Johann Heinrich Fehler, gathered the crew and made an announcement. The war was over. They would surface and surrender to American forces. Weber's mission to Japan ended before it began. The technical documents he carried, the high-altitude interception tactics, the engineering specifications, all of it would be delivered to American intelligence instead of Japanese engineers. Weber climbed to the conning tower as the submarine surfaced. The Atlantic stretched to the horizon, empty and blue. Somewhere to the east, Germany was burning. Somewhere to the west, Japan continued fighting a war it had already lost, and the B-29 seconds flew on, unopposed, delivering destruction from altitudes where no defender could reach them. The knowledge Weber carried might have helped 6 months earlier. By May 1945, it was obsolete. Not because it was wrong, but because the industrial and material gap between America and its enemies had grown so large that tactical improvements no longer mattered. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Meanwhile, over Japan, the reality Weber had tried to prevent was unfolding. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most experienced fighter pilots, flew his final mission on March 10, 1945. He had survived 4 years of combat, from the invasion of China to the defense of the home islands. He had shot down 64 Allied aircraft. But on this night, climbing to intercept B-29 seconds over Tokyo, he knew he was flying towards something he couldn't defeat. Sakai's Mitsubishi A-6M50, modified with a more powerful engine for high-altitude interception, struggled to climb past 25,000 feet. The B-29 formation flew at 29,000, 4,000 feet above him, and rising. His engine coughed and sputtered. Cylinder head temperature climbed into the red. Oil pressure fluctuated. At 26,000 feet, his climb rate dropped to less than 50 feet per minute. He watched the B-29 seconds pass overhead, their contrails white lines against the black sky, untouchable. Ground controllers vectored him toward a lower formation, B-29 seconds flying at 23,000 feet. Sakai pushed his 0 to maximum power and closed the distance. At 1,000 yards, the bomber's defensive turrets opened fire. Tracers converged on his fighter from multiple directions. He jinked left, then right, trying to spoil the gunner's aim. But the fire followed him, tracking with mechanical precision. He fired a burst from his cannons, saw his rounds fall short, and broke away as 50 caliber rounds punched through his left wing. Sakai descended to 15,000 feet, his engine trailing smoke. He had been in combat for less than 30 seconds. His fighter was damaged beyond repair. He had not scratched a single B-29. Below him, Tokyo burned. The B-29 seconds had dropped incendiary bombs that started firestorms consuming entire districts. Sakai could see the flames from 20 miles away, a red glow that lit the underside of the bomber formations, still arriving overhead. He radioed his base. "I cannot reach them. No one can reach them. They own the sky." It was an admission that would have been unthinkable 2 years earlier, but by March 1945, it was simply true. The B-29 seconds flew at altitudes where Japanese fighters exhausted themselves trying to intercept. And even when interception succeeded, the bomber's defensive fire and structural strength allowed most to survive and return to base. The strategic equation was brutal. Japan had approximately 400 operational fighters defending the home islands. America had over 400 operational B, 29 seconds, staging from the Marianas, with more arriving every week. For every fighter Japan sent up, America could send a bomber. And the bomber flew higher, carried more firepower, and was protected by defensive systems that made it nearly invulnerable to conventional fighter attack. Japanese pilots were brave, experienced, and skilled. But bravery couldn't overcome physics. Colonel Masao Sato, commanding the 244th Fighter Regiment at Chofu Airfield, compiled a report in April 1945 analyzing the effectiveness of Japanese high-altitude interception attempts. The statistics were devastating. Japanese fighters had flown 1,237 sorties against B-29 formations in March. They had shot down 18 B-29 seconds, a loss rate of less than 2% for American bombers. Japanese fighters had lost 311 aircraft, a loss rate of 25%. The kill ratio was 17-1 in favor of the Americans. Sato's report concluded with a stark assessment. Air defense of the home islands against high-altitude B-29 raids is not operationally feasible with current fighter performance and armament. Enemy bombers operate above the effective Ws, ceiling of our aircraft. When interception is achieved, enemy defensive fire inflicts unsustainable losses. Recommend development of surface-to-air missiles, high-altitude rockets, or acceptance that strategic bombing cannot be prevented by conventional means. The report circulated through Japanese Army and Navy aviation commands. No one disputed its conclusions. The B-29 had accomplished what its designers intended. It flew too high for effective interception. Its defensive armament was too powerful for conventional fighter attack. Its pressurized cabin allowed crews to operate comfortably at altitudes where attackers struggled to breathe. And American industrial capacity produced B-29 seconds faster than Japanese fighters could destroy them. But the irony was that by May 1945, the B-29 seconds had stopped flying at high altitude. LeMay's analysis of bombing effectiveness had proven what Weber and Petillo had discovered independently. High-altitude precision bombing didn't work. At 30,000 feet, clouds obscured targets, winds scattered bombs, and accuracy dropped below 10%. The B-29's theoretical invulnerability through altitude was real, but it came at the cost of effectiveness. LeMay had changed tactics in March. Instead of high-altitude precision raids, the B-29 seconds began flying low-altitude incendiary missions, 5,000 to 8,000 feet, below the altitude where Japanese radar could effectively track them, low enough for accurate bombing of urban areas. The change was devastating. At low altitude, B-29 seconds could see their targets clearly. Bomb sites could calculate accurate trajectories. And the massive bomb loads, no longer constrained by fuel consumption from high-altitude climbs, increased to maximum capacity. Japanese fighters could intercept at low altitude, but by then, it didn't matter. The B-29 formations were so large, the defensive fire so intense, that interception remained suicidal, and the few B-29 seconds lost to fighter attack were replaced immediately. American production had won the war before a single bomb fell. The ability to build 500 B-29 seconds per month meant that tactical victories were meaningless. Japan could shoot down 20% of every raid and still be overwhelmed by the volume of bombers arriving overhead. On the night of May 25, 1945, a B-29 formation struck Tokyo again. Captain Robert Morgan, piloting the lead bomber, flew at 7,000 feet, low enough to see individual buildings through his bombsight. Japanese anti-aircraft fire filled the sky with bursting shells, but the flak was ineffective. The B-29 seconds armoured fuselages absorbed damage that would have destroyed earlier bombers. Morgan released his bomb load and turned for home, his aircraft scarred but intact. Behind him, 500 tons of incendiaries fell on Tokyo's industrial district. The fires burned for 3 days. When reconnaissance aircraft photographed the damage, analysts counted 16 square miles of complete destruction. The factories that built Japanese fighters, the refineries that produced aviation fuel, the warehouses that stored ammunition, all gone. The B-29 seconds had destroyed Japan's ability to fight without losing a single bomber on the mission. Morgan wrote in his personal log that night, "We were designed to fly at 31,000 feet, above the reach of any defender. Tonight, we flew at 7,000, and it didn't matter. The Japanese can see us, their fighters can reach us, their guns can hit us, but they can't stop us. Not because we're invulnerable, but because there are too many of us and not enough of them. The high-altitude capability gave us confidence. Industrial production gave us victory." The final mission of the strategic bombing campaign occurred on August 14, 1945, hours before Japan accepted the surrender terms. Over 800 B-29 seconds struck targets across the home islands in the largest single raid of the war. Japanese fighters attempted interception. A few bombers were hit, damaged, forced to abort. But the formation continued, dropping bombs with mechanical precision, then turning for home. Of the 800 bombers dispatched, 798 returned safely. Lieutenant Hiroshi Nakamura, the same pilot who had discovered the B-29's fire control system on March 9th, flew his last mission that day. His Ki-84 had been patched together from parts salvaged from 3 different aircraft. He had fuel for 30 minutes of flight time, barely enough to reach the bomber formations and return. He climbed to 15,000 feet, searching for targets. Above him, at 25,000 feet, a formation of B-29 seconds flew in perfect formation, their contrails white lines across the blue sky. He watched them pass, knowing he would never reach their altitude. His engine was tired, his aircraft damaged beyond full repair, his nation defeated. He descended back to his problem, airfield, and landed. Ground crews were already burning documents and preparing to surrender. The war was over. The B-29 seconds had done their work. Nakamura climbed out of his fighter and looked up at the sky. The contrails were fading, but he could still see them, white lines that marked the path of an aircraft he had never been able to touch. That altitude, he thought, was the future. The side that controlled the high ground controlled everything below. After the war, American aviation engineers examined Japanese fighter aircraft and interviewed pilots about their experiences combating B-29 seconds. The accounts revealed a pattern of desperation and improvisation. Japanese engineers had developed oxygen injection systems to boost engine power at altitude. They had designed new superchargers and turbine systems. They had tested rocket boosters and pressure recovery systems. None of it had been implemented in time. Japan had the knowledge, but lacked the industrial capacity to apply it. Weber, interrogated by American intelligence after U-234's surrender, provided his own assessment. "We understood altitude operations theoretically. We built experimental aircraft that could reach 50,000 feet. But we could not build them in quantities that mattered. The Americans succeeded not because their engineering was superior, though it was, but because they could manufacture advanced aircraft faster than we could design them. By the time we understood what was needed, they were already producing it in thousands." The B-29's legacy extended far beyond World War II. Its pressurized cabin became standard on all post-war airliners. Its remote turret system influenced bomber defensive armament for decades. Its long-range capability enabled strategic bombing doctrine that defined Cold War military planning. And its ability to operate at extreme altitude established a principle that remains true today. Control of the high ground, whether terrestrial or atmospheric, provides decisive advantage in warfare. But the B-29's most important contribution was less tangible. It proved that complex systems engineering, supported by massive industrial production, could overcome tactical and technological challenges. The bomber was not invulnerable. It could be shot down, damaged, forced to abort missions. But there were always more. The assembly lines in Wichita and Renton never stopped. For every B-29 lost, 2 more rolled off production lines. That industrial logic, more than any engineering achievement, determined the war's outcome. In 1947, Weber published a memoir of his wartime experiences. The final chapter discussed the failed mission to Japan. He wrote, I carried knowledge across an ocean, hoping to change the course of a war. But the knowledge was obsolete before I departed. Not because it was wrong, but because the enemy had moved beyond the questions we were trying to answer. They asked, "How high can bombers fly?" We asked, "We intercept them?" They asked the right question. We were still struggling with the previous war's problems while they built solutions for future conflicts. Sakai, who survived the war and became an automotive engineer, was interviewed by an American journalist in 1968. Asked about the B-29, he said, "It flew where we couldn't reach it. When we did reach it, we couldn't hurt it. When we hurt it, there were more behind it. That bomber taught me that wars are not won by individual bravery or tactical skill. They are won by nations that can build machines faster than the enemy can destroy them." Japan learned that lesson in the sky over Tokyo. It was the most expensive education in our history. The B-29 flew its last combat mission in 1953 during the Korean War. But its influence continued. Every strategic bomber developed afterward, from the B-52 Superfortress to the B-2 Spirit, inherited design principles first implemented on the B-29, pressurization for crew comfort at altitude, defensive systems that protected against fighter attack, range sufficient for intercontinental missions, payload capacity that allowed single aircraft to deliver strategic effects. The B-29 established the template. On a technical level, the B-29's achievement was reaching 31,850 feet with a combat load. On a strategic level, its achievement was rendering that altitude capability irrelevant through overwhelming production. The bomber could fly higher than any defender could follow, but it won the war by flying in formations so large that altitude became unnecessary. The irony was not lost on the men who designed, built, and flew it. They had created a machine capable of technical perfection, then defeated their enemies through industrial mass production instead. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.